The Texas sun had a way of bleaching everything down to bone. By mid-morning, the dirt streets of Dry Creek shimmered with heat, and even the cicadas seemed tired of their own song. People no longer looked up to the sky for rain. They looked down into their cracked palms, wondering how long the town could last without water. Wells had turned shallow, crops shriveled, and thirst had become as common as dust. At the edge of Main Street, in the shadow of Ben Kessler's blacksmith shop, Jude sat with his back to a warped fence. 12 years old, lean from hunger, his shirt patched more times than he could count. He had been working since dawn, hauling coal for the forge in exchange for a crust of bread. Now, with the forge hammer echoing like a slow drum beat, he unwrapped what little he had left, a half-stale biscuit he had hidden in his pocket. He cupped it in both hands as if it were treasure. Hunger made him careful. He broke off a small piece, held it near his lips, and was about to take the first bite when something blurred at the edge of his vision. A flash of brindled fur, a sharp bark, half playful, half desperate. Then teeth small, quick, and the biscuit was gone. Jude blinked in shock. The thief was a puppy, ribs sharp beneath a coat the color of sun-baked clay, a white blaze across its chest like a mark branded by fire. The pup darted 2 steps away, biscuit clenched in its mouth, then turned back to look at him. Not with fear, with challenge. "Hey!" Jude's voice cracked, more from surprise than anger. His first instinct was to lunge forward. The pup danced just out of reach, ears perked, tail twitching like a flag. Something strange flickered inside Jude, more than hunger, more than frustration. The animal's eyes, dark and bright, were locked on his. They didn't taunt, they invited. Without thinking, Jude pushed himself to his feet. He chased. The puppy darted down the dirt road, past the faded storefronts where townsfolk lingered with empty buckets. A woman glanced up from her porch, muttering about that stray again. 2 men loading sacks of grain paused to smirk at the skinny boy sprinting after a dog like it held gold. Jude didn't care. His bare feet pounded the ground, his heart hammering against the cage of his ribs. Dust rose around him. The puppy kept glancing back as if to make sure he followed, each look like a beckoning hand. Through the square they went, past the boarded-up fountain that had been dry for years. Children stopped their play to stare. The preacher shook his head, muttering something about fools chasing shadows. Jude hardly heard them. The dog led him farther, toward the edge of town where the ground grew harsher, where the creek bed that once gave the town its name lay cracked and lifeless. Jude stumbled on loose stones but kept on, his hunger forgotten, replaced by a burning curiosity he couldn't explain. The puppy leapt over the dry channel, scrambled up the opposite bank, and bolted into a line of mesquite trees. Their twisted branches clawed at the sky like skeleton fingers. Jude pushed through, branches scratching his arms, sweat stinging his eyes. Then, as if the land itself had opened a secret, the trees parted. Before him stood a cabin. It leaned with age, its roof sagging, window shutter hanging crooked like a drooping eyelid. Weeds choked the porch, and the wood was grey as ash. Everyone in Dry Creek knew of this place, the abandoned Whitlock cabin. Older folks whispered about the woman who once lived there, an engineer of sorts, someone who had talked about channeling water, about making the town drought-proof. Then one day she vanished, and the town stopped mentioning her name. The puppy trotted to the door, biscuit crumbs still clinging to its muzzle. With a push of its snout, the door creaked open. Dust swirled in the air like ghosts rising. Jude froze at the threshold. Every warning he had ever overheard about this place-cursed ground, off-limits, "Don't let the children wander," echoed in his skull. If Ben or Reba from the diner caught him here, he'd be whipped back to the street. But the pup's bark cut through his hesitation. Not a sharp bark this time. It was low, insistent, almost coaxing. As if saying, "Come in. Jude's stomach tightened. Not from hunger, but from something deeper, a pull he couldn't name. He took a step inside. The floor groaned under his weight. Light filtered through gaps in the roof, laying slanted beams across warped floorboards. Cobwebs hung like curtains. The puppy padded straight toward the far wall. Jude's eyes followed and stopped. Carved into the wood, darkened with soot or coal, was the image of a sun with 12 jagged rays. The lines were rough, yet deliberate, retraced again and again as if someone had tried to keep the mark alive, even as time wore it down. The pup whined, pawing at a spot near the floor where the boards seemed oddly out of place. Its nails scraped, rhythmic, like a drumbeat. Jude crouched. His fingers found a faint ring of iron embedded in the board. He pulled. The plank resisted, then gave with a groan, releasing a breath of air that was shockingly cool and damp. His nostrils flared. Water. Not the memory of it. Not the smell of stagnant wells. This was fresh, alive. The puppy wagged its tail, barked once, sharp and clear, the sound bouncing off the empty cabin walls. Jude stared into the dark hole beneath the floor, heart thundering. For the first time in months, maybe years, he allowed himself to believe. There was water here. Real water. And somehow, the puppy had led him to it. That was the moment Jude's world shifted. What began with half a stolen biscuit was about to tear open the secret that could save or destroy the entire village of Dry Creek. The cabin's silence pressed down like a weight. Dust floated in beams of light that angled through the broken roof. Jude stood still, chest rising and falling, listening to the faint whistle of wind through the cracks. His pulse hadn't slowed since he'd pulled that iron ring and smelled the cool breath of earth from beneath the floor. The puppy, no, not just any puppy, but this strange, stubborn little creature paced across the warped boards. Its nails clicked, stopping now and then as it sniffed at corners, tail straight like an arrow. It was leading him, Jude realized, not wandering. It had brought him here for a reason. He crouched low again where the dog scratched, running his fingers along the edges of the plank until he found a seam. He hooked his hand around the iron ring and tugged harder this time. The board lifted with a long groan, and a square of shadow yawned open. A rush of air rose up, damp, cool, alive. The dog gave a sharp bark and bounded down, disappearing into the dark before Jude could protest. "Wait," Jude hissed, but his voice sounded weak in the empty cabin. He hesitated only a moment before lowering himself through the opening. The ladder rungs were rough and splintered, but sturdy enough. Jude's feet touched stone, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. His breath clouded faintly in the dimness. The walls around him were built of rock, fitted tight without mortar, as if hands with endless patience had placed each stone. A lantern hung crooked from a hook, its glass smudged with age. Beside it, wrapped in canvas, was a bundle of dry matches. Jude's fingers shook as he struck one, lighting the wick. Warm glow chased back the shadows, revealing a chamber that didn't feel like ruin at all. It felt like waiting. On one side stood a wooden workbench. Tools lay scattered, rusted but recognizable. Chisels, rulers, a compass with one broken leg. On the wall above were marks scratched in charcoal and chalk measurements, arrows, diagrams of tunnels. And at the very center, carved deep into the stone, was the same 12-rayed sun he'd seen upstairs, but larger, blackened around the edges as though fire had once kissed it. The puppy sat at the base of the carving, looking up at it, chest rising and falling. For a moment, Jude felt as if the dog understood more than he did. He stepped closer to the bench. A leather-bound notebook, edges curled from damp, rested beneath a scrap of canvas. He brushed off the grit and opened it. The first page held a hand-drawn map. His eyes widened. The lines traced the dry creek bed, the surrounding hills, the very town of Dry Creek itself. But this map showed something else too. Lines that branched beneath the earth, dotted with circles marked as springs. Some were crossed out. Others were circled twice, bold, as if urgent. Jude flipped the page, heart thudding. There were notes written in a hand that was firm, deliberate, with ink smudged by time. Calculations about flow, angles, the kind of math he'd only seen the schoolteacher scrawl on a chalkboard. Scribbled in the margins were warnings. If the stream runs dry, look to the narrow bend. Do not let one man hold the key to water. The boy's throat tightened. Whoever had written this hadn't just been drawing plans. They had been leaving instructions, like breadcrumbs, for someone in the future. Something small and metallic slid against his boot. He looked down. The puppy had nosed a box half buried beneath scraps of wood. Its lid was cracked. Jude pried it open and found a pendant resting inside. It was heavier than it looked, a disc of tarnished bronze. In its center was the same sun emblem, rays jagged as if cut by fire. Along the rim, barely visible, were etched initials. A W. Jude whispered the letters aloud. The sound echoed strangely against the stone. The pup barked once, a low sound that seemed to answer. A sudden noise above made Jude jolt. A door slammed somewhere in the town beyond, faint but sharp. His stomach knotted. Was someone close? Had they seen him slip into the cabin? He closed the notebook and stuffed it under his shirt, the bronze pendant pressed against his skin. It felt cold, almost biting, but it steadied him. The puppy nudged his leg, impatient, as if to say, "Move." Jude climbed back towards the hatch, the lantern flickering below. He looked once more at the burnt sun carved into stone, blackened as if scorched by something more than flame. The weight of the pendant, the map, the words in the margins, everything whispered the same truth. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin. It was a vault, a secret someone had tried to bury. He pulled himself into the light of the cabin, chest heaving. The puppy bounded after him, biscuit crumbs long forgotten. Its eyes shone, bright and fierce, fixed on Jude as though waiting for his next step. The boy sat on the floorboards, notebook pressed to his chest, pendant heavy at his throat. He felt small, but not the way he used to when townsfolk ignored him. Small the way someone standing at the mouth of a canyon feels small aware of the enormity of what lay ahead. The dog tilted its head, ears forward. Jude managed a breathless laugh. "Guess it's you and me now," he whispered. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the faint scent of rain that never came. Inside, in the dim cabin with the burnt sun on its walls, Jude held the key to a secret, powerful enough to change the fate of Dry Creek. And the puppy, his unlikely guide, seemed to have known it all along. Morning broke sharp and dry, the kind of light that showed every crack in the earth. Jude crouched on the back step of the cabin, the notebook spread across his knees. Scout, as he'd started to call the puppy, nosed close, ears flicking, as if reading along. Dust clung to the pages where his fingers had brushed them, but the inked lines remained steady. A map of Dry Creek, both above and below the ground. He traced the dark strokes with a fingertip. Springs, crossed-out wells, arrows that curved underground like veins. His eyes landed on one spot marked with a bold circle. Foxmouth Bend. The words were scrawled in heavy ink, then underlined twice. Foxmouth. Jude whispered. He'd heard the name before. Older boys used it like a dare, swearing the place was haunted, a slit of canyon where coyotes screamed at night. He had never gone. Too far. Too lonely. But here, on the map, it was drawn like the throat of something alive. Next to it, in smaller writing, a line chilled him. If the stream runs dry, look to the bend. The pup gave a soft growl, pawing the page as if impatient. Jude shut the notebook and stood, brushing dirt from his trousers. His stomach tightened. If this map was right, the creek hadn't died of drought alone. Someone had strangled it. He set off toward the hills, Scout trotting close, tail high. The town lay quiet behind them. Shutters closed. People resigned to another day of thirst. Nobody noticed the orphan boy slipping away with a half-wild dog at his heels. The path out of town narrowed into rock and scrub. Mesquite scratched his arms, and sweat slicked his brow long before he reached the ridge. The dog ran ahead, darting, circling back, urging him on. More than once, Jude thought of turning back. What if the townsfolk were right and the cabin was cursed? What if he was chasing ghosts? But the memory of cool air from that trapdoor tugged him forward. By midday, the canyon walls rose sharp around him, sheer stone stained red with iron. Foxmouth Bend. He knew it the moment he saw it. Two walls of rock closing in so tight that even sunlight had trouble forcing its way through. At the narrowest point, a wall of stacked stone sealed the throat of the passage. It was no natural fall. The rocks bore tool marks, chisel scars, a dam built by human hands. Jude's breath hitched. He scrambled closer, fingers brushing grooves in the stone, fresh enough to mock the years of drought. Scout barked and clawed at the base, dirt scattering beneath his paws. Water stains darkened the rocks, evidence of what had been trapped behind. Jude opened the notebook again, turning pages until he found a sketch. The drawing matched this very spot. Next to it, a name signed in careful script. A Whitlock. Underneath, another line of warning. Never let the bend fall into greedy hands. The boy froze, heart hammering in his ears. Whitlock. The name whispered like something half-remembered, a shadow from the edges of his own story. He had never known his parents. Folks in Dry Creek had always shrugged when asked, muttering that orphans were plenty and best not questioned. But here, the name felt heavy, tethered to him somehow. He mouthed it again. Whitlock. The syllables stirred something buried, a flicker of memory voices murmuring, a woman's laugh that rose like water running over stone, gone before he could hold it. His throat tightened. Could this a Whitlock be tied to him? A rustle snapped him back. Loose pebbles tumbled from the ridge above. He pressed against the rock, clutching the notebook to his chest. Scout bristled, growling low. Bootsteps. Two figures appeared at the canyon rim men he recognized from the square, men who answered to Arthur Baines, the town's mayor and merchant. One spat tobacco into the dust. The other scanned the canyon floor, eyes narrowing. "You hear that?" the taller man muttered. Jude held his breath, pressing Scout close. The pup stiffened, but instead of barking, he sank low, every muscle taut. Together they listened as the men spoke. "Boss says the kid nosing around that cabin is trouble," the shorter one said. "If he's poking near Foxmouth, we've got a problem. Baines won't want anyone sniffing at his dam." The tall man replied, "Best keep it quiet. We'll check again tonight." The word dam stuck like a knife. Jude felt the truth slam into him. Baines had done this. He had starved the town by cutting off the creek, selling grain and water at his own price. The drought wasn't fate. It was theft. The men's voices faded as they moved along the ridge. Pebbles rattled, then silence. Jude dared to breathe again. Scout pressed against his leg, eyes locked on his. For a moment, the dog seemed more human than beast, steadying him. Jude looked back at the wall of stones, at the mark of chisels, at the name in the dust of the notebook. A Whitlock. His hands shook, but his resolve hardened. Whoever Whitlock had been, whatever link tied them together, Jude carried the burden now. He closed the notebook with a snap. "We can't let them keep this," he whispered. Scout licked his hand once, as if sealing the vow. The canyon felt different as they left. the air heavier, the silence louder. Jude knew he wasn't just a boy chasing a stray anymore. He was holding a secret strong enough to break the stranglehold on Dry Creek. And the dog, this stray with the fire-marked chest, wasn't just a companion. He was a sentinel, leading Jude deeper into a story written long before either of them had set foot in the cabin with the burnt sun. The cabin seemed to breathe differently at night. Jude slipped back inside as the last streaks of daylight drained from the horizon. Scout padded at his heels, ears twitching at every sound. The air held that faint coolness again, the memory of water beneath the floorboards. Jude pulled up the hatch and lowered himself into the stone chamber. Scout scrambled down after him, landing lightly. The lantern still hung on its hook. The wick burned to ash. He struck another match, coaxed the flame to life, and shadows leapt across the walls. The burnt sun carved into the stone looked alive in the flicker. He set the notebook on the workbench, thumbing back to the map. His eyes darted between the lines and the canyon wall he'd seen earlier at Foxmouth Bend. The sketches showed more than just tunnels. There were mechanisms, wheels, shafts, channels like arteries hidden under Dry Creek. He traced a set of arrows to a circle drawn at the very center of the system. A wheel. Scout barked once, sharp. He was pawing at the far side of the chamber. Jude followed. Lantern held high. At first he saw only stone, but then his light caught the outline of iron teeth embedded in rock. A massive gear, half buried, connected to a wooden shaft running deeper into the wall. Dust coated it thick, but the lines were clear. His chest tightened. This was no ruin. It was a machine, sleeping. "Do you see this?" he whispered, voice breaking in awe. Scout nosed the gear, then looked up at him, eyes glinting. Jude reached out, fingers brushing the iron. Cold, rough. He pressed harder, and the gear shifted a fraction. The chamber shivered. A deep groan rolled through the stone, low and endless, like the earth itself sighing awake. The floor trembled beneath them. Jude staggered, clutching the lantern. Scout barked wildly, tail stiff as pebbles rattled loose from the ceiling. Then came another sound, faint but unmistakable, the rush of water moving somewhere deep below. Not a trickle, a surge. Jude's pulse thundered. He yanked his hand back, but the gear kept turning, slow at first, then grinding with momentum. Shafts hidden in the walls clattered to life. The notebook's warning screamed in his mind. Never let one man hold the key to water. Scout whined, circling him, pushing with his body as if urging him towards the ladder. Jude grabbed the notebook, stuffed it under his shirt, and hung the pendant around his neck. The bronze disc thudded against his chest like a heartbeat. From above came a slam. The cabin door. Voices, heavy boots on wooden planks. Jude's stomach dropped. Someone was here. He doused the lantern, plunging the chamber into darkness. Scout's breathing was the only sound he could hear over the groan of the turning wheel. He pressed himself against the wall, holding the pendant tight. "Check down there!" A man's voice barked from above. The hatch creaked, hinges protesting. Light from a lantern cut down through the opening, stabbing across stone. Jude held his breath. Scout crouched low, silent now, every muscle trembling. A hand appeared on the ladder rung, then another. Someone was climbing down. Jude moved without thinking. He darted for the opposite corner, dragging Scout with him. The notebook pressed against his ribs, the pendant cold as ice. He saw the iron ring that lifted the hatch's secondary escape, another mark he hadn't noticed before. With a desperate tug, a section of wall swung open just enough for him to squeeze through. "Down here!" The man's voice echoed, closer now. Jude shoved Scout ahead into the narrow tunnel, stone scraping his shoulders. He pulled the wall closed behind him, heart slamming in his throat. Voices shouted in the chamber. A lantern crashed, sparks flying. He crawled forward, knees and elbows raw, Scout leading with quick, sure steps. The tunnel angled upward, the scent of earth growing stronger. Behind him came the sound of men tearing through the chamber, boots striking stone, curses thrown like knives. Then silence. Jude reached the end of the crawl and shoved at a loose plank. It gave way, spilling him and Scout into the night air behind the cabin. He lay in the dirt, gasping, the notebook still clutched against his chest. Scout stood guard beside him, ears pricked, scanning the shadows. The wheel below still groaned faintly, a vibration he could feel through the ground. Somewhere far off, he thought he heard water rushing where it hadn't in years, but his victory felt short-lived. Someone had seen the hatch. Someone knew. Jude pressed a hand to Scout's fur, grounding himself. "They'll come after us," he whispered. The dog's eyes shone in the starlight. Steady. Fierce. He wasn't just a boy with scraps of bread anymore. He was the keeper of a secret too big for his thin frame. And now the town's most powerful men knew he had touched it. Scout licked his hand once, then faced the dark horizon, tail rigid like a flag planted in defiance. Jude followed his gaze. The fight for Dry Creek had already begun. By dawn, Dry Creek stirred with sounds it hadn't heard in years. Buckets clanged, children shouted, and women called each other from porches. Along the edge of town, where the creek bed had lain cracked and lifeless, thin rivulets now trickled through the sand. Not much, only enough to glisten in the sun, but enough to send a jolt of hope through the village. People pressed forward, stooping to touch the wet earth as if testing a miracle. One boy smeared mud across his face, grinning. An old woman cupped her hands and let the water slip through her fingers, tears cutting trails down her cheeks. Arthur Baines watched from the steps of his store, jaw tight. The mayor wore his usual wool vest despite the heat, but today sweat slicked his collar. He forced a smile for the onlookers, murmuring words about blessings, about the mercy of weather, but his eyes betrayed unease. He knew it wasn't rain that had done this. Something had shifted beneath the ground, and if the wrong person discovered how, the whole game he'd been playing for 15 years would collapse. Across the street, Ben Kessler leaned against the forge door, arms folded. The old blacksmith's face was darkened with soot and lined from decades of heat, but his eyes were sharp. He remembered the woman who had come to town years ago with maps and sketches, talking about harnessing underground streams. Whitlock, she'd called herself. Most folks laughed her off. Baines had smiled politely, then announced she'd run off with strangers when the creek dried up soon after. Ben had never believed that. And now, watching the boy Jude skulk through the alley with a strange pendant glinting against his chest, something stirred in his memory. The boy's jawline, the set of his eyes, it was like seeing her shadow walk again. That evening, Jude slipped into the back of Reba's diner. The place smelled of coffee grounds and cornbread, though supplies had been rationed to crumbs. Reba herself, a tall woman with hair streaked in grey, slid a plate toward him under the counter. Scout hopped onto the bench beside Jude, tail thumping quietly. "You keep showing up hungry, I'll start charging that mutt of yours," she muttered, but there was warmth in her eyes. Jude pulled the notebook from under his shirt, laying it between them. "Can you read this?" His voice was hushed, urgent. Reba wiped her hands on her apron and bent low, adjusting her glasses. She flipped through pages, brows knitting. "This isn't just scribbles. These are engineering notes, flow rates, lever ratios, channel diagrams. Whoever wrote this knew more about water than half the county." "It says Foxmouth Bend," Jude whispered. "That's where the rocks were stacked." Reba's eyes flicked up, sharp. "Boy, do you know what you're holding?" "This is evidence. If the right person sees it, Baines is finished." Scout growled suddenly, low and steady. Jude turned to see a shadow pass the diner window, lingering. He slid the notebook back under his shirt. The dog's hackles stood, ears tracking until the figure moved on. Reba leaned closer, lowering her voice. You need to keep this hidden. Folks around here have gone missing for less, but I'll help you read it piece by piece. She tapped a page where a sketched wheel was marked with arrows. This here. It's no accident the water started flowing today. You must have triggered it. Jude swallowed hard. I touched the gear. It moved. Reba sat back, eyes wide. Then you woke the machine Whitlock built, and if I'm not mistaken, that makes you the only one alive who knows where the heart of it beats. Jude's chest tightened. Whitlock, he said softly. Who was she? Reba studied him for a long moment. She was a fighter. Tried to give this town a future. Folks said she was a dreamer, but I knew better. And now I see you walking in with her notebook. I can't help but think. She trailed off. Think what? Jude pressed. That you might be her blood. The room felt suddenly smaller. Scout nudged Jude's hand, as if grounding him. Across town, Arthur Baines slammed his office door. They're whispering her name again. He snapped at his foreman. Whitlock. If that boy spreads what he's found, we lose everything. His hands shook as he poured whiskey, spilling some on the desk. Find him. Quietly, before the water speaks louder than me. But outside the diner, where Scout sat poised at the door, the truth had already begun to seep. The ground hummed faintly with the stirrings of water. Buckets clanged as villagers tested their luck at the old wells, pulling up damp rope and smiling for the first time in years. The water was speaking. And Jude, clutching the pendant at his chest, realized it was speaking through him. The air at Foxmouth Bend smelled of stone and secrets. Jude crouched near the stacked wall of rock, notebook open on his knees, the pendant heavy against his chest. Scout stood beside him, ears pricked, scanning the canyon as though the walls themselves might move. Reba's voice echoed in his memory. These notes talk about a secondary release valve. A way to let water through slowly, so it won't drown the village. The diagram had been simple enough. A lever hidden in the canyon floor, connected to the great wheel underground. Pull it, and the dam would bleed water back into the creek. Here, Jude whispered, brushing dirt away with his hands. His fingers struck iron. A buried handle, rusted but solid. He gripped it, pulled hard. It resisted, then groaned, shifting the earth under his knees. A vibration hummed through the canyon, low and steady. Scout barked sharply, circling. The dog knew water was moving. But then another sound sliced through the canyon. Laughter. Cold, familiar. Well, well. A man drawled. The little orphan thinks he's an engineer. Jude's stomach clenched. From the shadows, Cam stepped forward, flanked by 3 men with rifles slung across their backs. Cam's hat brim shaded eyes that glittered with cruelty. He had been Baines's enforcer for years, a man who smiled only when someone else suffered. You shouldn't be down here, boy, Cam said. This is grown men's work. You meddle with that wheel again, and you'll bring trouble you can't handle. Scout snarled, teeth bared, stance rigid. Jude forced himself to stand, dirt streaking his hands. You built this dam. You're the reason the wells are dry. Cam chuckled, slow and mean. You think you've uncovered a secret? I built more than this dam. I built the way things work in Dry Creek. Folks buy water from Baines because they have no choice. And now you've gone and woken the old machine. The men with rifles shifted, uneasy. Cam raised his hand. But I'm fair. We'll open the gates, just not for everyone. Not for the squatters on the south end. Let the water wash them out, and the land will finally be worth something. Jude's throat tightened. You'll drown them! Cam leaned closer, his voice a hiss. That's the point. Scout lunged before Jude could stop him, snapping at Cam's leg. Chaos erupted. One of the men swung his rifle like a club. Scout dodged, but the stock caught his flank. The dog yelped, rolled, and scrambled up again, limping but defiant, eyes burning. Jude felt fury rise, hot and sharp. He shoved the lever down with all his weight. The canyon shuddered. A deep roar built from behind the dam. Cracks spidered through the stacked stone. Water surged, spraying in sudden bursts. "Idiot!" Cam shouted. He motioned to his men, but the ground gave way under their boots as water tore through the false wall, gushing into the dry channel. Villagers appeared at the canyon mouth, drawn by the noise. Ben Kessler among them, hammer in hand, Reba right behind. They stopped dead at the sight. The dam breaking, Cam's men flailing, Jude braced against the lever with the dog at his side. Ben's voice thundered, "Cam! You tried to drown half this town?" Reba's eyes darted to Jude, then to the pendant gleaming on his chest. She seemed to understand everything at once. Cam, sputtering from the spray, pointed at Jude. "It's him! The brat's the saboteur! He's tearing the canyon apart!" Jude shook his head, chest heaving. "He's lying." The notes, my mother's notes, said this would save the village. He wanted to flood the poor lands, not me. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ben stepped forward, his voice steady. "I knew Whitlock. And I see her blood in that boy. You can spin your lies, Cam, but you can't hide the truth anymore." Scout staggered to Jude's side, blood matting his fur where the rifle stock had struck, but he stood tall, growled steady. The villagers saw it too, a boy and his dog, standing against men who had stolen their lifeblood for years. The water rushed harder, filling the creek bed, coursing toward town. It wasn't a flood. It was balance, the system working as Whitlock had designed. Cheers broke from some, gasps from others. Cam knew he'd been caught. He tried once more, voice cracking. "You'll regret this, boy. You don't know the kind of war you've started?" Jude met his gaze, fear churning in his stomach, but his voice firm. "The water was never yours to keep." The canyon echoed with the roar of returning water. For the first time in years, Dry Creek flowed again, and its people had seen with their own eyes who had tried to keep it from them. And though Scout leaned heavily against Jude, flank trembling, his eyes burned with the same fire as the boys. The battle wasn't over, but together they had survived the first strike. Night pressed down heavy on Dry Creek, the kind of night where every sound seemed sharper, every shadow deeper. Jude sat at a corner table in Reba's diner, the notebook spread open in the faint glow of a kerosene lamp. Scout lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, ears twitching each time the wind rattled the shutters. The town had been buzzing all day since water trickled again through the creek. Some called it a miracle, others whispered of curses. But all eyes had shifted toward Jude, the boy no one had paid much attention to until now. He felt that weight pressing harder than the heat ever had. His fingers turned the brittle pages until something caught, a folded sheet tucked deep in the binding. Different paper, thinner with a careful crease. His heart quickened as he drew it out. Across the front, written in a steady, elegant hand, were 2 words. "For M." "M," Jude whispered. His throat tightened. He unfolded the letter. Reba slid into the seat opposite him, setting down 2 cups of weak coffee. "What's that?" she asked, catching the tremor in his hands. Jude passed it over. It was hidden. Reba adjusted her glasses and read silently, lips moving. Scout raised his head, as if sensing the shift in the air. The letter spoke of water as if it were alive, a force that could heal or destroy. It told of building the system, of hiding the key to its heart, of fear that one day the wrong men would twist it to their will. And then came the line that stole Jude's breath. "My child, you are of the water. If ever you hold this letter, remember the name I gave you, Matteo. The pendant is your inheritance. The wheel will know your hand. Reba looked up slowly, eyes glistening. M, she said, her voice hushed. It's you. Mateo, that was your name before folks called you Jude. And this? She tapped the letter with a trembling finger. This is from Amara Whitlock, your mother. The room tilted around him. Jude clutched the pendant at his chest, its bronze edges digging into his palm. My mother built all of this? Reba nodded. She designed the water system, every channel, every valve. They laughed at her. Then they drove her out when she refused to let Baines control it. We thought she was gone for good. Her voice broke. But she left this for you. Jude pressed the paper to the table, as though it might vanish. His mind reeled with fragments of memory, the faint echo of a lullaby, the smell of rain on stone, a woman's laugh that had lived in the corners of his dreams. For the first time, they felt real. Scout pressed his head against Jude's leg, steadying him. The boy let out a shaky breath and scratched behind the dog's ear. She knew, he whispered. She knew I'd come. Reba leaned forward, urgency sharpening her tone. Listen to me, Mateo. That pendant isn't just a keepsake, it's the master key. It can trigger every valve your mother built. With it, you could free the water for everyone, or lock it away forever. The words struck like a hammer. Jude felt both awe and dread. A boy who had once hidden crusts of bread in his pocket now carried the power to feed or starve an entire town. Before he could respond, the diner's door banged open. Ben Kessler stepped inside, soot streaking his face. His eyes found Jude at once. Baines's men are restless, he warned. They're saying the boy's a thief. They'll twist today's flood into a crime. You need to move careful. Jude straightened, letter clenched in his fist. They already know I touched the wheel. If they find this... He tapped the notebook. They'll destroy it. Ben's gaze softened. Your mother was the bravest soul I ever met. I should have protected her. I won't make the same mistake with her son. Scout growled suddenly, eyes on the window. A shadow lingered outside, then slipped away. Reba rose quickly, bolting the door. The air grew taut with unspoken truth. Jude wasn't just an orphan anymore. He was the child of Amara Whitlock, the woman who had built the heart of Dry Creek. And now he held in his hands the power she had died to protect. He looked at Scout, at the scar on the dog's flank from Foxmouth Bend, at the steady way those dark eyes watched him. If I'm really Mateo, he whispered, then I have to finish what she started. The dog gave a single sharp bark, as if to say he already knew. In that moment, the boy who had been Jude the orphan felt himself changing. The water had begun to speak, and now it called him by his true name. Mateo Whitlock, the child of water, the keeper of the key. The sky above Dry Creek glowed with the pale light of dawn, but beneath the earth the true awakening was about to begin. Jude Mateo now, as the letter had named him, stood before the great wooden wheel hidden deep below the cabin. Villagers packed behind him, their faces pale from sleepless nights and from the weight of hope they barely dared to carry. The wheel loomed taller than 3 men, its spokes thick with dust, its rim worn smooth by years of silence. Scout stood in front of it, chest forward, tail rigid, as though guarding something sacred. The dog's ears flicked, catching the distant vibration of water pressing against the closed valves. Reba placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder. It has to be you, she said, her voice low. Your mother built this for your hand. Ben Kessler, soot still clinging to his shirt from the forge, stepped up on Mateo's other side. His eyes scanned the wheel, the gear teeth, the iron lever waiting to be pulled. The system's sound. She knew what she was doing. You release it here, the water will flow back through every channel. The whole town will see it. Mateo's fingers tightened on the pendant at his chest. He could feel the etchings of the sun, the mark of his mother's hand. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the crowd behind him heard it. He looked down at Scout. The dog met his eyes, steady, unflinching. For days, Scout had led him to every truth he had uncovered. Now, in this final step, the dog seemed to whisper without words. Trust. Mateo took the lever. At first it didn't budge. He set his feet, pulled with both hands. The wheel groaned, dust raining from the ceiling. The villagers gasped as the spokes began to move, creaking, shuddering, then rolling forward with a deep rumble. The ground trembled. From far below, a roar rose up water, rushing, alive. It burst through the underground channels, slammed against closed gates, and surged free. Outside, in the streets of Dry Creek, fountains that had been dry for a generation suddenly gushed. The old well beside the church overflowed, sending streams down the steps. The creek itself, long a scar of cracked stone, filled in seconds, water foaming white against its banks. Children screamed with joy, men dropped to their knees, women wept openly. But the sound of salvation was also the sound of reckoning. By midday, the square was packed. Villagers gathered, buckets in hand, clothes damp from splashing in the creek. At the center stood Arthur Baines, his face pale, vest soaked with sweat. Reba and Ben flanked Mateo, notebook clutched in the boy's arms. Scout stood before them all, barking sharp and strong, his voice cutting through the noise until the square fell into silence. Mateo stepped forward, lifting the notebook high. "These are my mother's plans," he said, his voice carrying farther than he thought possible. Amara Whitlock built the water system for all of Dry Creek. 15 years ago she was cast out because she wouldn't let one man control it. Arthur Baines took her work and buried it, and we've been paying the price ever since. Gasps rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned on Baines. His lips twisted into a smile that looked more like a snarl. Lies. Convenient tales from a half-starved boy. You'll believe him over the men who've kept this town alive? Ben's hammer slammed against the cobblestones with a crack that silenced even Baines. Alive? The blacksmith growled. You starved us. You let children go thirsty while you sold water by the drop. I knew Amara, and I see her fire in this boy's eyes. Reba's voice rose, fierce. The water speaks louder than you now, Baines. And the town has heard it. Cam stepped from the crowd. His face was cut, dirt streaked, his hat lost at Foxmouth Bend. He looked older, beaten down. For the first time, his voice lacked menace. I saw what the boy did at the bend, he admitted. I saw what I did too. I was ready to flood families out of their homes, but it wasn't him. It was me. I won't run from it. The villagers muttered, shifting. Some spat at Cam's feet. Others nodded grimly. His confession cracked the last of Baines's defense. Baines opened his mouth to speak, but the roar of Scout's bark drowned him out, long and commanding, as though the dog himself declared judgment. Mateo lifted the pendant for all to see. The bronze disc glinted in the noon light. This is the key to every valve beneath our feet. It belongs to no man, no mayor, no merchant. It belongs to all of us. The crowd erupted. Shouts rose, fists in the air. Buckets tipped, splashing water onto the stones like baptism. And in that storm of voices, Arthur Baines shrank, his power dissolving as quickly as sand under a flood. Cam lowered his eyes. If you'll have me, I'll stay. I'll work to mend what I broke. His words were met with silence at first, then cautious nods. Dry Creek had seen what power could do in the wrong hands. Perhaps redemption, too, could be tested. Mateo stood tall. Scout pressed against his leg. The notebook and pendant clutched close. He had been the boy no one noticed, chasing a stray for half a biscuit. Now he was Mateo Whitlock, child of water, voice of a town reborn. And as the creek sang its long-forgotten song through the heart of Dry Creek, Scout lifted his head to the sky and barked not for glory, but for home. The cabin that once loomed like a ghost on the edge of Dry Creek now stood reborn. Its crooked window had been repaired, its walls straightened, and across the rough boards of the door, Reba had painted a circle with 12 rays and emblem that matched the pendant Matteo wore close to his chest. They called it Casa del Sol, the House of the Sun. It was no longer a place of whispers and dust, but the heart of a new beginning. Inside, the great wheel hummed with quiet strength, turning steadily to guide the water back through channels that Amara Whitlock had designed years before. The air smelled of damp wood and fresh plaster, and the sound of flowing water filled the space like a steady heartbeat. Matteo stood by the wheel with Reba and Ben, the three of them chosen by the townspeople to be the guardians of the system. Their job was not to hoard knowledge, but to protect it, to ensure that no single person could ever again strangle the town with thirst. "We'll keep it open," Ben said, his calloused hand resting on the iron lever. "Anyone who wants to learn how it works will learn." "That's the way it should have been all along," Reba nodded, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "No more secrets, no more trades in shadows. Water isn't currency, it's life." Matteo listened, his fingers brushing over the pendant. He could almost feel his mother's presence in the wheel's rumble, in the cool air that rose from the tunnels beneath. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving day by day. He had a purpose and a place. Scout circled the wheel, nose to the ground, then trotted back to Matteo with a bark that echoed through the cabin. The dog seemed to understand, in his own way, that this place was sacred. He had led Matteo here, after all, from that stolen half-biscuit to this moment where an entire village's fate had shifted. Now he guarded the House of the Sun with the same loyalty he gave the boy. In the days that followed, the system was opened to everyone. The channels filled, not only the central creek, but the small irrigation lines that had been dry for years. Crops revived in the fields. Wells that had been dust traps gurgled with clear water. People laughed freely again, their voices lightened by hope. Matteo often found himself standing at the edge of the square, watching the townsfolk draw water without fear of debt or punishment. Children filled tin cups and splashed each other. Women filled jugs, humming songs they hadn't sung in years. Men lifted buckets not with dread but with pride, knowing their families would not go thirsty. And one morning, as the sun stretched gold across the square, Arthur Baines appeared. No guards flanked him. His vest was no longer pressed, his shoes scuffed with dust. He carried a dented bucket in both hands and walked with a weight that was heavier than pride could mask. The villagers noticed. Murmurs rose, but no one stopped him. He shuffled to the end of the line, behind the children, behind the farmers, behind the widows who had once begged him for a ladle of water. Matteo watched from the steps of Casa del Sol. Scout sat at his feet, ears pricked. For a moment the boy expected defiance, a sneer, some sharp word from the man who had ruled through thirst. But Baines only lowered his eyes, shifting his weight as though the ground itself pressed judgment against him. When at last his turn came, he dipped his bucket into the cistern like everyone else. The sound of water filling it was loud in the hush. He did not look up, not at Matteo, not at Reba, not at the crowd. He stepped aside, carrying the bucket carefully, as though afraid of spilling even a drop. The silence broke when a child laughed nearby, splashing her brother with a tin cup. The sound spread, loosening the air. One by one, the villagers turned back to their tasks, their conversations, their lives. Ben leaned against the doorframe beside Matteo. "That's his reckoning right there," the blacksmith said quietly. "No jail, no rope. Just waiting at the end of the line, same as the rest of us." Reba's gaze lingered on Baines as he walked away, His shoulders slumped. "It isn't forgiveness," she murmured, "but it's a beginning." Matteo nodded. The pendant pressed warm against his chest, a steady reminder that power could corrupt, but it could also heal if shared. He glanced down at Scout, who met his eyes with a steady look. The dog gave a short bark, almost approving, before lying down on the cool stone step of the cabin. From that day forward, Casa del Sol was more than a building. It became a promise that no secret would again turn water into a weapon, that no child would be forced to swallow dust where a drink should have been. And at the heart of it all stood a boy once nameless, now Matteo Whitlock, and a stray dog who had carried him to destiny. The weeks after the wheel turned felt like a different lifetime for Dry Creek. The air no longer carried the dry crackle of dust, but the cool scent of water running free. Fields turned green again, children's laughter spilled across the creek beds, and the sound of buckets filling was no longer desperation. It was life. Inside Casa del Sol, the wheel never stopped. Its rhythm had become the heartbeat of the town, and beneath its shadow, Scout lay curled, as if guarding the very lifeline he had helped restore. The villagers placed a small wooden plaque by his resting place. The words carved into it read, "He didn't bark for glory. He barked for home." It was simple, but when Matteo traced the letters with his finger, his chest tightened with gratitude. That scrappy puppy who once stole half a biscuit had given the whole village back its future. Matteo no longer the nameless orphan, but Jude Matteo Whitlock sat at a table in the newly restored cabin. A clean notebook lay open before him. The old one, his mother's, was carefully wrapped in oilcloth and stored by the wheel, safe for generations to come. This fresh book was his, not for secrets, but for truth. He dipped a pen in ink, hesitated, then wrote the first line with steady hand. "If the water flows again, it's not because the skies remembered, but because we did." The words seemed to echo the lesson carved into every stone, every drop of water that coursed through Dry Creek now. It hadn't been a miracle, nor the mercy of weather. It had been courage, loyalty, and the refusal of a boy and his dog to stop chasing what was right. From outside, Scout barked once, sharp and sure, as if answering. Matteo smiled. He left the book open, pages ready for more, and walked outside into the sunlight. The square was alive. People moved with purpose, shoulders lifted by something greater than survival. Ben was teaching 2 young boys how to read the markings on the wheel, passing down the skill with patient hands. Reba handed out bread by the water trough, her laughter ringing like a bell. Even Cam, sleeves rolled and face marked with dirt, hauled stones to clear the last of the blocked channels, and at the far end of the line stood Arthur Baines. No vest, no speeches, just a man with a dented bucket, waiting quietly like everyone else. He filled it last, nodding once at Matteo as if acknowledging the shift he could no longer undo. Matteo walked back to Scout, kneeling to scratch the dog's neck. The puppy's coat, once ragged, gleamed under the sun. His eyes shone with the fire of a guardian who asked for nothing but to belong. "You found it first," Matteo whispered. "You found the way." Scout leaned into him, pressing warmth into the boy's chest. He hadn't barked for glory. He had barked for home, for the right of every child to drink, every farmer to plant, every family to stay. And in that moment, with the wheel humming behind them and the creek singing beyond, Matteo knew the truth would outlive them both. The last page of his notebook would one day carry a question, written not for himself, but for anyone willing to listen. What's your story with a loyal pet? Because in Dry Creek, a puppy's bark had saved a village. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, where courage runs on 4 legs and loyalty changes lives, then support the channel dedicated to these guardians' German Shepherd. Every story you share, every voice you lend, keeps their legacy alive.